Okay, our first speaker is Dr. Kim Sherman. She's a historian, writer, textile artist from Wilmington, North Carolina. Her research is largely centered around social and environmental history in the British Atlantic world and in the Lower Cape Fear. She received her PhD in modern history from the University of St. Andrews in 2018. Having worked in higher education for 15 years, she is currently a lecturer in history at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. Without further ado, Kimberly. Thank you. Please don't be offended if I'm in and out.
Oh, no, not at all.
Sun.
Oh, wow. Fantastic. Just in time.
Sunshine. I told you.
Right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for braving the weather and having a little faith in the day getting better. I want to start off, first of all, by thanking the North Carolina Rice Festival Board for inviting me here today, for being a part of this. They've been fantastic since I got to know them about 3 years ago, and have been working with them since then. And of course, I want to thank Jim and all the staff here at Brunswick Town, Fort Anderson for really pulling out all the stops to make sure everything's running smoothly today. So thank you. But the other person that I want to thank, unfortunately, isn't here with us today. I'd like to thank the late Mr. George Beatty, of course, for his just the enthusiasm and the love that he had for not only the history of rice cultivation here in the Lower Cape Fear, but also Gullah Geechee history. It's very odd to be here today without him, and I have to say thank you to him for actually bringing me into all of this when he called me up in 2021 and said, hey, do you want to be in a documentary that we're making about rice? And it really kind of jump-started my love of this subject once again. So I want to say thank you to him. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Eagles Island today. I'm going to be talking about kind of the shifting cultural and environmental landscape there over the past couple hundred years. We are living in an epoch that many refer to as the Anthropocene. It's a geologic unit of time that describes our Earth's most recent period of history when human activity started to have a significant impact on the planet's climate and ecosystems. More recently, some scholars have proposed that we are currently in yet another era, the Plantationocene. That since the age of exploration and the beginning of European colonization in the Americas, we have entered an epoch characterized by the ecological impacts of large-scale exploitation of natural resources, monoculture, or cash crop agriculture, and forced labor. While the plantation era might seem part of our distant past, it continues to shape our lives today. The Lower Cape Fear here, of course, is a prime example of the greater effects of this so-called Plantationocene, and if that is the case, we might consider Eagles Island the epicenter. Eagles Island, as you might know, is an area roughly 2 miles wide by 7 miles long, situated at the confluence of the Cape Fear and Brunswick rivers and roughly between Wilmington and Leland. The island, or rather set of islands in some ways, is about 3,100 acres in size, and it was formed from the alluvial sediments that were deposited here in the Cape Fear River as it wound its way to the Atlantic Ocean. And a collection of tidal freshwater marshes emerged there over thousands of years. Today, those wetlands are host to one of the highest degrees of biodiversity that we have in our region. Dr. John Haley, renowned historian of African American culture, once declared that almost everything that was important to the development of the Cape Fear region plays into Eagles Island. Soon after European settlement here, as Jim mentioned, that's around 1725-26, it became host to rice fields, turpentine stills, and lumber yards, evolving further as a center of the shipping industry in the post-Civil War era. We might consider Eagles Island and the Lower Cape Fear as a whole as a place of entanglement, where people, black and white, converge to reshape the landscape into a productive plantation machine. So in 1738, about a year before the incorporation of Wilmington, acreage comprised of the island's tidal wetlands was acquired by an Englishman named Richard Eagles from Bristol. Like many of the Lower Cape Fear's earliest settlements, he emerged and arrived by way of Charleston, where he had engaged in merchant and plantation activities there for a while. He was married to a woman named Elizabeth Crichton, who was a relative of another Lower Cape Fear resident, William Dry, who was the collector of customs here at Port Brunswick, and his wharves actually jutted out right here at the Cape Fear River, just a few hundred yards from where we're sitting today. And this connection to Dry brought Richard Eagles into a tight-knit kin group that was eventually known as the family in the Lower Cape Fear because it was so big and so powerful politically and economically. And they settled the Lower Cape Fear in the 1720s. Eagles accumulated hundreds of acres of land along both sides of the Brunswick River, and by the end of the century, the family owned at least 6,500 acres, and 900 of that were located on the island that would come to bear their family name. Like a lot of the surrounding land, Eagles Island was prime real estate for agriculture, and more specifically, the cultivation of rice. It took a while for this to develop, and a lot of the island was originally used for timbering and naval stores production. Not a lot of extraction going on there. They mostly did kind of the post-production there and then shipping it out from Eagles Island. And that's happening before the American Revolution. There's a small amount of rice being produced there in upland fields that were watered by a combination of rainfall and then diverting some upland freshwater streams to help water these fields and germinate the rice. But closer to that revolutionary period, the Eagles were likely beginning a slow shift to what we call tidal cultivation of rice, wherein we start to see fields that were divided by a grid-like system of dikes and canals and embankments into smaller plots of land, maybe a quarter to a half acre in size. And these would be watered by controlling the flow of the Cape Fear River's tides onto those fields by raising and lowering series of gates and so forth, and that could control that water flow on and off the fields as needed. The water level of tidal fields could be controlled more predictably, obviously, than rainfall and other ways of watering fields. And they would not have to be abandoned over time either, because the soil exhaustion just wasn't a problem, because if you have those tidal flows coming in and off, they're bringing in sediments from the river as well, which means that it's constantly renewing the nutrients in the soil. Eagles enslaved laborers processed naval stores and lumber from the surrounding longleaf pine savannas on Eagles Island, and they cultivated a small amount of indigo as well alongside of rice in years prior to the American Revolution. At the time, that was quite profitable because the British government actually offered a bounty or kind of an incentive to planters to produce these types of things. After the Revolution, those go away. So that's when we also start to see that shift towards rice in more industrial measures. The other thing, too, about looking at naval stores and indigo is that they worked well with rice production because they could be processed and they could be grown in kind of the off-season from rice. So it kind of all works together. You can kind of be productive throughout the year. By the time Richard Eagles died in 1758, he had amassed a fortune in land and enslaved property, which he passed on to his son and daughter. Richard Eagles Jr. took up the mantle from there, residing at the Forks Plantation just north of Old Town Creek, for the next decade before his death in 1769. The Forks lands included those that extended onto neighboring Eagles Island, and when the Scottish traveler Janet Shaw visited the area on the eve of the American Revolution, she noted the activity at the site, saying, "We saw his rice mills, his indigo works and timber mills, and the vast command they have of water makes those works easily conducted." To the north of the Forks lay Aspern, Bucoy, or in some cases it's been noted Buchawi, and Glastonbury plantations, all of which had lands extending from the west bank of the Brunswick River across to Eagles Island. And on the east side of the island, later on in the 19th century, there were Hallett Plantation, Osawatomie, and Bleak House, and these would be later developed as rice operations in the post-Civil War era, leading the area to be cross-hatched with levees and canals that can still be seen today. In the 19th century, the majority of the former Eagles family property at the Forks and Aspern were owned by a Sterling B. Everett, who was a Brunswick County physician and planter who acquired his holdings in 1835, and about 300 or so acres of that were located on Eagles Island. By 1850, Everett could boast well-maintained fields and excellent milling facilities that churned out more than 635,000 pounds of rice a year. It's estimated that at its height, up to 75% of Eagles Island consisted of rice fields. A few years later, in 1853, Everett's lands were sold to a planter named Thomas McElhenney, whose vast agricultural enterprises extended across at least 4 plantations and 6,600 acres. In addition to his new holdings in Brunswick County and Eagles Island, McElhenney owned Greenfields, a plantation site south of Wilmington, and the area around Greenfield Lake today. The Greenfield site included up to 180 acres of rice land, numerous structures including 2 barns that could accommodate up to 15,000 bushels of rice, and 2 grain mills. And across these 4 operations, McElhenney enslaved at least 70 people who spent their days clearing land, planting rice, maintaining fields, and processing harvests. In 1860, they produced more than 864,000 pounds of rice. This is the high point of rice production in the Lower Cape Fear, right before the Civil War begins. This was second only to Thomas Mears at the Bluffs over here in Brunswick County, who maybe had about 500 more pounds of rice than McElhenney, but it was pretty close there. The harvest pushed McElhenney's net worth to $164,493, which might not seem like a lot today, but that would actually equate to $6 million today. So he was very, very wealthy. And none of this would have been possible without the exploitation of enslaved laborers. When Richard Eagles had died way back in 1758, his estate included 73 enslaved people of African descent. Some had likely been born here in the Lower Cape Fear. Many had been brought here by way of Charleston slave traders, and a few perhaps came directly from West Africa, though those numbers are incredibly low for the entire 18th century, mostly because there simply wasn't the capital here in the Lower Cape Fear to entice slave traders from West Africa to bring their enslaved cargoes directly here. Through their connections to West African rice-growing cultures from Gambia and Sierra Leone, to name a few, as well as the large rice plantations and operations down in South Carolina, the local enslaved population developed and maintained many aspects of the unique culture that has since become known as the Gullah Geechee. Enslaved Africans and their descendants who labored on Lower Cape Fear plantations did so in especially brutal conditions. The mud work, as they often called it, of rice cultivation was backbreaking from the initial clearing of tidal, cypress, and gum trees to the creation and maintenance of hand-dug canals. Not to mention the planting, cultivation, and harvesting of rice crops between the months of March and September, or the potential hazards of a swampy environment, snakes, alligators, and tropical disease, to name a few. With the switch to tidal cultivation, the use of enslaved labor in the Lower Cape Fear ballooned. Planters estimated that at least 30 enslaved laborers would be necessary to ensure a plantation's productivity. And when Thomas McElhenney purchased the Forks in 1853, there were 53 people enslaved there at that site. Gullah Geechee laborers engaged in the cultivation of rice were living close to the fields where they worked in and day out. These small, inauspicious dwellings would have dotted the landscape of Eagles Island in sharp contrast to the few planter-class dwellings that were built over the years. Supposedly, way back during the colonial period, William Dry built the first brick house on Eagles Island, close to a ferry landing site that was directly opposite of Wilmington. My own research hasn't really unveiled any other big dwelling sites there in the 19th century, in the antebellum period. And not until about 1923 do we actually see another house erected for white residents, when a man named R.F. Ham built the first so-called modern house there adjacent to the Ham Marine Railway on a tiny plot of land about directly across from the foot of Church Street in Wilmington. Ham called it Edgewater. Very few of these domestic structures remained into the 20th century as time and tide led them to ruin. In fact, one of the few traces of domestic life on the island today is the variety of non-native ornamental plants that can sometimes be seen, the shrubs and so forth, azaleas, daffodils, irises, all that kind of stuff. And these might have, of course, been existing alongside of homes the past 200 years or so. Planters likely viewed Eagles Island as uninhabitable by their own families due to the high mortality rates that they faced with the presence of malaria and other tropical diseases. Even on the mainland plantations of Brunswick and New Hanover counties, planters attempted to vacate their operations during what they called the sickly season. Not knowing the real cause of their maladies was the swarms of mosquitoes prowling the swamps in the late summer and early fall, planters decided to take their families and head inland towards towns like Somerville here in Brunswick County, or out to the coastal areas of Topsail or Masonboro Sounds. And this part-time absenteeism of leaving their plantations allowed the enslaved who remained on rice plantations to work throughout the year to have some periods of relative isolation and independence. And this might give them some time to either retain or remake traditional African and Atlantic ways of life, resulting in a uniquely African American culture like the Gullah Geechee. Though this culture did not develop to the same extent that we might see as on the more isolated sea islands of the South Carolina and Georgia Lowcountry, it still left an indelible mark here on the history and lives of people. Fast forward to the Civil War, and this, of course, would bring ruin to the livelihoods of the planter class and shattered the slave labor system, stripping the Southern economy along with it. But Lower Cape Fear freedmen, now also joined by many Gullah Geechee refugees from the South Carolina and Georgia Low Countries who followed Sherman's army up here in 1865, acted to remake the post-war social and economic landscape. Rice plantations became the sites of negotiation between freedmen who were now pushed into sharecropping or tenant farming, and white landowners, some of whom were actually their former enslavers. As early as May of 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau, the kind of organization, the government organization that was put together to try to aid freedmen after emancipation, these commissioners oversaw labor contracts between men like S.P. Ivy and 37 freedmen on the Waddell and Swanfield plantations on Eagles Island. Ivy would provide land, seed, tools, and living quarters to the laborers, and the black laborers cultivated the rice fields and would then be furnished with rations from the U.S. government through the Freedmen's Bureau. The contract stated that, quote, the said freedmen are to labor until the rice is secured and prepared for market, and that one half of the crop or its equivalent in cash lawful currency would be divided among them as payment. If Ivy or others reneged on their part of the contract, shares would be divided with the Department of Negro Affairs for the support of the helpless. When planters could not persuade freedmen to labor on rice fields voluntarily, they turned to other sources of labor. While the 13th Amendment had outlawed slavery and involuntary servitude in general, it continued to allow forced labor when used as a punishment for crime. In the years immediately following the Civil War, states across the South began adopting legislation that would curtail the civil rights and civil liberties of recently freed blacks. These black codes, as they became known, were intended to control the behavior of black Southerners and to enforce social and economic controls over their lives. In many ways, it allowed white Southerners to recreate a society that was as close to that of the pre-war slave society as possible. With such laws, many black men and women faced arrest and imprisonment as convicts for things simply as not having a job or deciding to leave their current employment. An increase in convicts due to the black codes led to the creation of a state prison system. A new convict lease system also relieved the state of housing prisoners in a penitentiary by leasing them out to the highest bidder, who was then responsible for the care and restraint of them, with the right to use them as he so desired. White planters justified their manipulation of the system based on what they deemed a labor shortage. And this so-called labor shortage was a newly freed and enfranchised black working class seeking to exercise their mobility and improve their circumstances. Many of them simply did not want to return to that mud work that they had been forced to be in during the antebellum period. This new mobility, of course, did not align with planters' desire for control. And as historian Matthew Mancini argues, convict leasing is in fact best understood not as part of the history of prisons, but as part of the elaborate social system of racial subordination, which had previously been assured by the practice of slavery. And in many ways, that lease system was a component of a larger web of law and custom, which effectively ensured the South's racial hierarchy. North Carolina would actually be the first southern state to take advantage of convict labor for large-scale agricultural projects. According to 1880 federal census records, 37.9% of people in North Carolina were black, but 85% of its prison inmates in the North Carolina penal system were black as well. In the Lower Cape Fear, a convict farm was built at Castlehane in 1892, and the convict lease system became a regular source of labor for area landowners. I mentioned earlier there were a few small plantations that popped up on the eastern side of Eagles Island in the late 19th century: Hallett, Osawatomie, Lirius, and Bleak House. I think Bleak House especially is aptly named, where convict labor would soon be in use. The Navassa Guano Company, that some of you might have heard about recently, also leased convicts to work in its rice fields that extended from what is today Navassa over into Eagles Island. 36 convicts worked the rice fields on Eagles Island in the 1890s, producing about 10,000 pounds of rice in 1898. And the following year, 45 convicts were employed there, with numbers swelling to over 100 when the harvest came in. After the crop had been stacked and stored, the convict laborers were transferred to railroad and public works projects across the state. In addition to a series of devastating hurricanes, the final death knell for rice culture in the Lower Cape Fear came with ongoing improvements, as they called them, to the Cape Fear River and the Port of Wilmington. Dredging projects by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers were intended to widen and deepen the river for commercial activities at the port, but consequently reshaped the entire ecology of the river system and inundated the tidal wetlands with salt water from the Atlantic Ocean. With such improvements, freshets, or kind of seasonal floods with rainfall and so forth, became more damaging to tidal rice fields. Every storm served as a test of the structure of rice plantations, and high maintenance costs plagued planters as a result. Dredging ultimately increased the salinity of the Cape Fear River, and as a greater volume of seawater pushed upriver with the tide, it increased the acidity of the soil, affecting nearly all of the old rice fields by the end of the 20th century. It would be near impossible to use these fields for rice cultivation in the future, and that led many planters to begin drainage projects to convert rice lands to truck farms and other types of profitable enterprises. In 1933, a photographic survey depicted a few active rice fields on Eagles Island. And this coincides with kind of what we know of the waning history of the practice, which coincides with some oral histories we have of knowing that the last known crop of tidal rice that was produced in the Lower Cape Fear was produced in 1935. Today, the history of rice cultivation and the labor of the Gullah Geechee men and women that made it profitable exists like scars on the landscape of Eagles Island. Drive across the northern portion of it and you'll spot some remnants of a canal or an embankment, but instead of staple crop agriculture, the swamps have retaken the land as native species continue to regenerate. Wildlife flourish here, including a few endangered and federally protected species. And about 1,500 acres on the southern end of Eagles Island is now largely reserved for dredge spoil as the river continues to be worked on and deepened. The rest of it is held by a handful of private owners and government entities, including the towns of Leland and Wilmington. And going back to what Dr. John Haley has said about Eagles Island, he said, it's interesting that it's one of the only Gullah Geechee land sites in North Carolina that hasn't been turned into what he calls the so-called new plantation of golf courses, country clubs, and suburban home sites. And that's the main question facing us today. What about development on Eagles Island? Developers, of course, want to get their hands on this prime real estate, while conservationists argue for the protection of wetlands and the island as a site of historical and cultural significance for the Gullah Geechee. The big factor, of course, is water. The tidal wetlands of Eagles Island continue to be a place of upheaval, as much of the West Bank is a compound flood zone, and large-scale flooding events, even only a few of those being hurricane-produced, just regular rainfall and so forth, even more recently have created hazards. Geologist Roger Shue, who is a colleague of mine over at UNC Wilmington, he's focused a lot of attention on the conservation of the Eagles Island and reminds us, quote, that the water will come. We need to learn to live with it instead of in conflict with it. Eagles Island is a special place. It's a reminder of our past, a testament to our present, and perhaps an augur for our future as Lower Cape Feareans. As wildlife biologist Drew Lanham writes, quote, place and land and nature, how we tie these things together is critical to our sense of self-purpose and our fit in the world. They are the Trinity. This is true for people everywhere, but nowhere is it truer than here in the South. Thank you.